start. Now, I talked last time about different ways in which you could construe the topic of Marxism. 5 different ways of thinking about that. I'd like to now talk a little bit about Marx, and in particular I'd like to start by talking about something which might seem to you to be relatively unimportant, but I think is not completely unimportant. That is, something about the nature of the Marxian corpus, the writings that Marx produced, and the order in which those writings became accessible to us. Now, normally, we don't think very much about this question. You have Kant, and you have Kant's works, and there are Kant's works, and he wrote things and he published them, and people read them. In the case of Marx, however, as you know, there's a funny phenomenon about the publication of his works that makes the publication of his works different, and the accessibility of his works different from the accessibility of Descartes or someone else. And this question of accessibility and effect is not irrelevant. Namely, roughly speaking, as you know, Marx wrote more things that were unpublished during his lifetime than things that were published during his lifetime. And furthermore, the things that were published in his lifetime tended to be from the later period. So in a way, the reception of Marx is the reverse of the historical order. The early writings are available, but of course, his doctoral dissertation is available in some sense. As you know, he submitted his dissertation in Jena, although he never studied in Jena. He studied in Berlin, but at that time, Jena, people in Jena tell me this, there was a special rule in Jena that you could submit your dissertation in Jena even if you'd never studied there, and the professors could award you the doctoral degree in absentia. And apparently this was a great source of income for the people in Jena tell me there was a great source of income for the professors in Jena, that they could give you a PhD. So the analog would be someone in Kansas sending us a PhD, and we award them the Cambridge PhD, although they never set foot in Cambridge, if they paid an appropriate amount of money. So Marx's dissertation was available because it was submitted as a doctoral dissertation in Jena and given that. But then there's a gap. The early writings are not really published, or they're only held in archives to which only a few people have access. Then it's the later writings, the later theoretical writings, that actually come into the public realm. Now, what this means, of course, is that when the Marxist political movements get started at the end of the 19th century, their image of what Marx was, what he thought, and what he could have thought, is determined by a particular small segment of what we now see is the Marxian corpus. So they had at their disposal Capital, which is a relatively late work. They didn't have at their disposal some of the things that we think are, in the 20th century, and people in the 21st century have thought are particularly important, such as the philosophic economic manuscripts, the German ideology, etc. They're works that are only discovered and published in the 1920s. So in a way, the later Marx, now you might say this is a trivial and unimportant difference, but of course it's not an unimportant difference if you have the view that people in the Marxist tradition do, that somehow there is and there must be a unity of theory and praxis. That is, if you have a relatively traditional idea about the nature of philosophy and the nature of science, then that idea says, one thing is you think the thoughts, they're true or they're false. Another thing is you apply them. They're two separate things. Aristotle has these thoughts. They're true or they're false. You can ignore the historical context. You can ignore who took them over. You can ignore who worked on them or not. That's irrelevant. If, on the other hand, you have the view that comes from Hegel, which Marx clearly thought, then the internal the history of the application of a theory is not an external fact about the theory, but the history of the way in which the theory has been assimilated, applied, and become institutionalized is an internal part of what the theory itself is. This is one of the things that's meant by this famous phrase that they use again and again, the unity of theory and praxis. The theory is not just supposed to be a freestanding body of propositions that are true or false in themselves. The theory is supposed to be something, an internal aspect of which is that it be assimilated in a particular way and people act on it in a certain way. So acting on the theory is internal to the validation of the theory itself. What that means is, if you have a political movement that's established at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century that assimilates a particular version of Marx's view, which is determined by one or two relatively late books, and then you have earlier works that have a slightly different perspective that are developed, then reading these early works and thinking about them can constitute some kind of politically deviant activity. And of course, that's actually the function that the reading of many of these early works had in the 20th century in Poland and in Yugoslavia and in other sorts of places. Reading the early Marx gave you a kind of Marx that was different from the Marx that was established as the state ideology in these places. So it's really important to see that this Hegelian view is deeply embedded in Marx. Theories are not there, as it were, to be true in some Platonic heaven. Theories are there to guide action. And therefore, the failure or the success of a theory in practice is not an external property about it. So when Sartre notoriously says at the end of the Second World War, the great advantage of Soviet Marxism over all other possible forms of Marxism is that it exists. So Sartre says, look, there are all sorts of ways you could think about Marxism. Yes, of course, that's fine. But if you think about Marxism in a way that would have been appropriate for Marx himself, you think about it not in terms of some ideal construction, you think about it as a thing that's actually embodied. And the actual embodiment of the theory is not irrelevant to that. So when Sartre speaks of Soviet forms of socialism as really existing forms of socialism, that for him is an endorsement. Now, of course, later the term der real existierende Sozialismus, which is the term that's used for the really existing forms of socialism in Eastern Europe, comes to be a pejorative description of this. But originally, it's not pejorative. It's a kind of compliment. So Lenin, of course, is a Marxist without ever having read the philosophic economic manuscripts and without ever having read probably the German ideology. So that's an important fact about the history. So when you look at the history of these things, you have to look at the history of these things in the context of what was available, what was institutionalized, how it was institutionalized, and what result that had. Okay, now, so once we now can look back, once in the 20th century they have more or less the whole corpus, you can look back on this corpus and you can have a certain first impression of it. And the first impression you can have of it is there seem to be two distinct strands in this corpus. There seem to be two different approaches, two different nuggets, two different kinds of theory. There's first a kind of Marx who is something like an orthodox Marxist thinker. That is, at various places Marx says, my theory is continuous with economics, it's continuous with history, it's a form of science. Engels famously talks about Marx having discovered the laws of motion of society. So one strand in Marx is Marx as an economist, or a particularly astute political economist, and where political economy is understood more or less in the way in which a Victorian gentleman in the 1860s or 1870s would have understood it. We know what a science is. historical materialism is a science. Historical materialism, he says, is not moralizing. It's not a moral view. It's a description of what actually happens and a description of what actually must happen. In the famous preface to the second edition of Capital, he says it's about the necessary transformations of one form of society to another, independent of what anybody might think about it, and the forms of consciousness. So it's an objective science in some way. It talks about necessary motions, necessary connections, and in that context, people's epiphenomenal beliefs are not important. And Marx sometimes talks in this way. You might call this the positivist Marx. So Marx is a kind of scientist who's talking about necessary forms of transformation, is against moralization, and is talking about not what ought to happen, but ways in which society will necessarily transform itself into another way. That's one strand. But then if you look at the early writings, you can see there's another strand, which is Marx doesn't look so much like a Victorian economist of a particularly high-powered kind. He looks like a Hegelian social philosopher. That is, if you look at the early Marx, it looks as if he has not a moral theory of society, but some kind of evaluative theory of society. It looks as if he's talking about alienation, he's talking about ways in which people are deformed, he's talking about ways in which society should be criticized. So there's an early view which seems to be a view that's very strong on Hegel. It's full of Hegelian terminology, it's full of interpretations of Hegel, and although it's not moralizing, it's evaluative in some way. Now, perhaps I should say something about that. Now, it is obviously true that Marx was always against moralization. But you have to remember that what he means by moralization is not the same thing as what we would mean by normativity. That is, he means something different from that. When he says philosophy should not be moralizing, there are three possible things he can mean. First, he can be rejecting moralizing in the sense of a Kantian or Christian form of ethics. That is, he can say moralizing is wrong if you mean by moralizing doing what Kantian philosophers think moralizing is, or Christians think moralizing is. Namely, Kantian philosophers think that you're moralizing if you abstract from the whole of the empirical world, you don't let your empirical impulses play any role in your evaluation at all, and you look simply at the formal structures of the maxims that you follow. And that's morality. Morality consists in following rules, that you follow rules, and morality is very different from anything that's empirical. So when he says, I'm not in favor of moralization, one of the things he means is, I'm against this Kantian approach. I don't think that the normative is a completely separate realm. It isn't something that's completely autonomous, comes from nowhere, has no relation to something that's empirical. It's not God standing up there and giving us imperatives. It's not pure reason giving us imperatives. It's not something where there's an opposition between describing the world and giving imperatives about the world. That's the wrong way to think about it. Now note, you can reject that and without rejecting evaluation. That is, you can have moral theories in a wider sense of morality. You can have evaluative theories which are not moralizing in that way. So, for example, the notion of grading or evaluation in the form of grading is a kind of normative practice, but it's a kind of normative practice that doesn't necessarily have this kind of moralizing component. That is, if I'm asked to grade apples, right? You give me the apples and I have grade A, grade B, grade C. Now, in having grade A, grade B, grade C, I'm not just doing descriptions. I'm evaluating the apples. But the evaluation of the apples is not a form of moralization of the process of the apple. I'm not saying the apples in class B are evil or are bad or reprehensible or they're responsible for me. They go to hell. I'm talking about their properties relative to certain relatively well-defined human purposes. And I'm talking about the suitability of these things for those purposes. And that's an evaluative judgment that I'm making, but not a moralizing judgment. And Hegel is very keen on this. He says, of course, you can evaluate some things as better, some things as worse, some things as healthy, some things as deviant. You can do all sorts of evaluation. It's just not the case that you should identify that wide realm of all the different ways in which you can evaluate things with the rigid distinction between the moral or the normative and the empirical. So from the fact that Marx keeps saying we don't want a moralizing approach, it doesn't follow that he doesn't have an evaluative approach. He might think it isn't that certain societies are evil or they violate some kind of absolute moral imperatives, but they're less good than other societies. So if I want to bake I don't know anything about this, if I want to bake a cake, I want apples of B category. If I want to eat the apple, I want apples of A category. And so I can say apples of A category, I'm hungry now, apples of A category are better. There's nothing moral involved with that. Similarly, you might say societies in which there is alienation of a certain kind are not as good as societies in which lack alienation. That doesn't mean I can give you a detached set of moral imperatives that defines in great detail what alienation is and shows why it's wrong in some other sense. So, okay, so let's get that. Let me not lose my track. So you've got one approach which is the positivist approach. You've got one approach which is this more Hegelian thing. Another thing, of course, so there are three things you can actually object to when you talk about something being moralizing. First thing you can object to is you can think that moralizing means Kantian or Christian, some kind of absolute, invariant, not relative to any human purposes judgment about the thing. And you can reject that, and you can reject that while still saying I can evaluate things relative to human purposes. Second thing is you can be against moralization in that you can think that some people think that by morally criticizing something, that a moral criticism of something has a cognitive content. So the other way in which you could say you're moralizing is you could say, instead of analyzing this, I'm just putting a predicate on it, right? My favorite example is, Tony Blair is about to invade Iraq, and this group of people come up to him who are experts in Iraq. And they say, you might have some problems here. You should think about this. Look, there are different groups in this. Iraq was cut out of the Ottoman Empire at a certain time, putting together various things in the interests of British women containing control of it. There are internal religious and ethnic and economic differences in the thing. You might have some problems if you just came in and you come in and just smash everything up. And it's reported that Blair said, well, but Saddam Hussein is evil, isn't he? Now that's an instance of moralization. What's wrong with it is not, as it were, the Kantian theory that's behind it. It's the idea that you can use a moral judgment, which might or might not be correct, and you can use that judgment short-circuiting every other consideration, as if that judgment itself was cognitive, as if that judgment itself gave you automatically the way you should act. So it might well, who knows? It might well be the case that Saddam Hussein was evil, but that was irrelevant, in a way irrelevant to the political context, because what these people were talking about was the empirical difficulties of doing this, and what were you going to do about this? So another sense of moralizing is short-circuiting, as it were, going from an overall judgment, which is an evaluative judgment, straight to some kind of thing. And the third thing, of course, is to think that moral preaching will be effective, right? The third thing is to think that the way to make the world better, the most effective way to make the world better, is by preaching to people and telling them what they ought to do and what they ought not to do, rather than, for example, changing their social institutions. Now, you can say that part of changing their social institutions will be preaching to them. I mean, you won't so again, preaching to them and changing the social institutions aren't necessarily two disparate things. But so the criticism of moralism then can be, you don't try to change the institutions or structures, you're not interested in that, you just try to change how people work by preaching at them. And that might be, and so Marx might well have said, my theory is not moralizing, and no theory should be moralizing, in one of these three senses. It isn't that we have a moral judgment that's completely independent of reality. It isn't that a moral judgment automatically gives you cognition of the situation or automatically allows you to see how to act on it. And also it might not be the case that moralizing is a good way of changing people's structures. So you might think all of those things without thinking that your theory had to be a theory which was completely non-evaluative. So what I'm trying to say is the positivist has a very strong view, generally a Kantian view, to the effect that there are cognitive things and there are moral things. And therefore, if this is going to be a cognitive theory, it has to have no evaluative aspect to it. But remember that when Marx uses the term science, that is Wissenschaft, remember Hegel's term for his philosophy is Wissenschaft. So when Marx says his Marx approach to the world is Wissenschaft, is scientific, that doesn't mean his approach to the world is like Newton's. Engels sometimes says it's like Newton's, but that's what Engels says, and that's what Engels says when he's standing on Marx's grave. You know, when you're standing on someone's grave, giving a grave speech, you're not necessarily being, that's different from being in a seminar. You say, I say all sorts of things at the side. I'm at the age now where most of my friends are dead, and you stand at the side of the grave, and you don't necessarily. I don't stand at the grave of my friend Dick Worthy and say, well, he didn't do this and he didn't do that right. And, he confused this and that. And, it would have been better had he done that. That's not that. So there's, okay, so the fact that it's scientific doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be positivistic in this way. Okay, so we've got this initial observation that we make. There seemed to be a more scientifically, more objectivist, more positivist position, and there seems to be a more Hegelian, contextualist, socially critical position. Now, once you have that initial impression, you can say two things. You can say that initial impression is right, or you can say that initial impression is wrong. You've got two possibilities. Now, if you say that initial impression is right, then you say, okay, there is this strand of quasi-evaluative criticism. There's this strand of prediction, explanation, structuring of that which is necessary. There are these two strands, and if you think they're different strands, you can ask the question, how are they related to each other? And now a hypothesis will suggest itself to you, I propose. One hypothesis that will suggest itself to you is these are different positions. The initial observation is right, and they're different positions, but the difference is to be explained historically. There's an early position and there's a late position. And there's an early position in which he was more like a Hegelian social philosopher, and there's a late position in which he's more like the thing that Engels described him as being. And so there are these two strands, but they don't have equal standing or equal value. They can be understood historically. And as you know, lots of philosophers were like this. There's a pre-critical Kant and there's a critical Kant. There are two Kants. There's a Kant before the Critique of Pure Reason, and there's a Kant after the Critique of Pure Reason. There's an early Wittgenstein, there's a late Wittgenstein. The early Wittgenstein has views about propositions, the late Wittgenstein has views about language games and changes his view. There's an early Heidegger, there's a Heidegger 1, and there's a Heidegger 2. There's an existential analyst of the human condition and the way in which we relate to time, and there's a person who tries to get away from conceptualization and tries to get away from anthropomorphism altogether and describe a history of being. So we're familiar with this schema of an early and a late one. And then you can say two things. you can say either. You either pick one, and then you can say either. Well, the early one was just his immature thing. He was a Hegelian to begin with. He didn't, but they were the eggshells behind his ears. Everybody develops, and so it's the late one that's really right. So the early one has some significance, but has some significance as a way of allowing us to understand how he developed to the late one. Or you can say, no, the early one is the one that's really significant. In the late one, he was corrupted by sitting in the British Library and being surrounded by these Victorian institutions in London. And he had this original view when he was in the 1840s, when he was trying to apply Hegel to the world, but he lost it, and he became just one more sort of dull Victorian economist at the end. So you can have either of those views. Now, as you know, the history of the interpretation of Marx in the 20th century is mostly defined by this kind of discourse, where you have people like Lukács, right, great Hungarian Marxist Lukács. As you know, Lukács, I've always had a soft spot for Lukács because Lukács's father spoke Hungarian and German. Lukács's mother spoke only German. And Lukács refused to speak German with his mother. So he spoke to his father in German and his mother in Hungarian, a language she didn't understand. I just thought that was a really good thing. The other thing, of course, was Lukács's wonderful. The other thing, of course, was Lukács's father was a banker, a Budapest banker, who funded his son's early literary career. So he funded Lukács's attacks on the banking system. Even before Lukács became a Marxist, he was a kind of anti-capitalist, and so old Mr. Lukács gave Lukács, first of all, tickets to go to Oslo to see the elderly Ibsen, because he was very keen on that. And he funded various literary magazines that Lukács published, all of them criticizing the way in which banks destroyed human culture. So I've always had a kind of soft spot for Lukács, because I've always think. Anyway, so he, of course, is one of the people who discovers the early manuscripts of Marx and publishes them and makes them accessible. And so he is of the opinion that basically it's this early Marx, this humanist Marx, who's connected with the Hegelian social philosophy, has a theory of alienation, has a theory of human development, has an evaluative theory of the world. That's the real one. And he doesn't quite dare to say, given the political situation, that after that he has a falling off. He doesn't quite dare to say that. But that's clearly the implication of the work. And of course, the authorities realize that's the implication of the work, and so he's excluded from the party and he has to do penance and various sorts of things too. So there's a Lukácsian tradition, which is the more or less tradition that says the early Marx is the real Marx. Then in the West, it's Althusser, I think, who's been the most influential person thinking about this. And of course, Althusser says, no, the early Marx is just a mistake. He's just a student of Hegel. He's just a minor student of Hegel and a minor student of Feuerbach. There's nothing original in him there. He hasn't really worked himself through, and this is connected then in Althusser with Althusser's theory of science, which of course is so. Althusser says Marxism is really a science. Now, when Marx says I'm doing something scientific, he means I'm doing something that's Hegelian, because Wissenschaft for him means Hegelian. When Althusser says he has to be scientifique, the notion of being scientifique for Althusser is, Althusser has a German name, but of course Althusser has a German name, but of course he's a French philosopher. He's at the École Normale Supérieure in the 60s and 70s, and he's notorious for always claiming to be absent when all decisions are made. I mean, it was very strange. Every time the French Communist Party did something strange, it was said that Althusser wasn't there at the meeting. And everybody thought that was pretty dubious. That was a diplomatic illness. But it turned out he was also clinically insane, and he would be taken off to the insane asylum occasionally. And he actually was not there. One of the important points is, what do you do in 1968 when the Warsaw Pact invades the CSSR? and the French Communist Party supported the Soviet position on there. And Althusser said he was not there for that meeting. And it turns out he wasn't there for that meeting because he was on Sainte-Anne in the psychiatric ward at the time. At the end of his life, as you know, he murders his wife. He writes this autobiography, wonderful autobiography, which begins by saying, Hélène was lying in front of me in her silk gown. I began massaging her neck as I always did. She seemed to like it. I massaged it more and more firmly. She seemed to like it even more. Suddenly, after 5 minutes, I looked down on her and she was completely blue. I stood up and ran shouting, I have killed Hélène! I have killed Hélène! Which he had. So then he was anyway, Althusser was the grand figure in this. And now he had a particular view of what scientific meant. Namely, his view of being scientific was both different from Hegel's view of what was scientific and different from our view of what would be scientific. That is, assuming that you're all good, paid-up members of the Cambridge Empiricists League. Namely, for Althusser, you didn't have a science as long as you used observational predicates in it. The notion of a science was the notion of something. So if you think of the empiricist model is you get observation, you get generalization, you move up from those observations to more and more general things. I see that you have glasses, I see that you have glasses, I see that you have glasses. I make a rule. People with glasses are sitting in the front. Then I make it more general. So you move up empirically, generalizing the empirical concepts. For Althusser, it's exactly the reverse. You don't have science until you break with empirical predicates altogether. So Newton makes physics a science not by taking everyday observational predicates, but by introducing a non-empirical predicate, namely gravitation, which, as you know, when it's introduced, is thought to be an occult quality. So for him, you only have a science when you have what he calls a coupure épistémologique, when you have a break between the accumulation of empirical things and something else which comes down and forms them. And so then he tries to reconstrue Marxism as a kind of science. And then he asks, where is the coupure épistémologique? Where does Marx actually and then you can say, and the analog to the notion of gravitation, for example, is surplus value, right? Surplus value is not an empirical concept. It's a theoretical concept. And so then you say, well, the early Marx is really pre-scientific. He's just a sort of social critic who does these various things. And he really only becomes scientific when he breaks with this and introduces these non-empirical concepts. And so then, of course, he asks, where is it the case that Marx really breaks with the empirical and introduces this coupure épistémologique? And first he says it's 1844, and then he says it's 1848, and then he says it's 1859. And so my teacher always used to say, well, Marx discovered in Marxism the theory of eternal youth. He could remain the young Marx until very late in his life, because every time you looked at it, the coupure épistémologique was at a later period. Eventually, I think he said it was only in his last writing, after Capital, that he really had the coupure épistémologique. So you've got these two views. You've got Lukács, humanist Marxism associated with Hegel, and you've got another form which is associated either with a relatively empiricist understood conception of economics, or with Althusserian notions about what science would mean, and you have those two. And so one thing you can do is you can choose between them. The other thing you can do is you can talk about a historical development from one to the other. And then, of course, you can say the initial appearance which motivated this discussion is incorrect. That is, the initial impression was there were two different views here. There was a Hegelian view which was socially critical. There was a view that was predictive. Actually, if you look at Marx, you can see that those two things are not incompatible with each other, because you can, and then you can have various views about that. For example, you can say, if you get away from the idea that a normative theory has to be a Kantian normative theory, if you think of normativity or evaluation as a more general concept, then it's not obvious that that's incompatible with having a theory that has a more scientific character. And if you think of science as not necessarily an activity that's put in a later positivist framework, then you can think of science too as having an evaluative character. You can think about Darwinism and Darwinism you can say, for example, Darwinism depends. Marx at one point thought of dedicating Capital to Darwin. You can think that Darwinism has a kind of evaluative thing in that it depends on talking about the relative appropriateness of certain species to their environment. So there's some notion there, which is not a moral notion, but it's not a non-evaluative notion either. So the third possibility then is to think that these oppositions, that this discussion in the 20th century rested on a number of assumptions that are dichotomous assumptions, which seem certainly don't seem to be absolutely obvious. Okay, now, so what I'd like to begin to do now is talk about the first of these two strands in more detail, and then I'll talk about the second, and then I'll try to talk about the relation between them. Now, the first of them is the idea of Marx as a social philosopher in the Hegelian tradition who has a critical and evaluative, but not normative or moralizing theory about the world. Now, this requires one to think a little bit about this concept, which is the concept of alienation, and that's what I'd like to talk about. So the general view is that, in fact, the early work is oriented around the concept of alienation and the overcoming of alienation, and that even in the later work where the concept of alienation doesn't explicitly occur, you can still see that there's some way in which this early discussion of alienation plays some kind of role in the later discussion. So what is alienation now? Now, it's really important to see that Hegel uses the term alienation in his own characteristic way to refer to a particular stage in the development of human powers and institutions. What's really important for Hegel is that for Hegel, everything is always in flux, really. And I think that's important for Marx too. You can take a snapshot of history at one time and talk about the things within that snapshot as if they were simply systematically there. But if you really want to understand things, you have to understand things in their development. Only in their development and their movement do you understand the world. That's a central Hegelian thought, and also thought that Marx has too. You can't understand the economy without understanding history. The economy is all historical. There isn't, right? He keeps saying, right? The 19th century British economists all thought there was one ahistorical form of society. That was the capitalist form of society. Maybe they thought that not everybody had got there, but they did think that once you got there, there was no more history. So that's a thing that Marx will never have any truck with. He'll never have any truck with the idea that the proper way to do things is to get well-defined fixed points and move between well-defined fixed points. To do that is inherently wrong from all points of view. So for Hegel, if you want to understand human life, you understand human development. What does it mean to understand human development? Then he says, well, if you look at human development, you'll see that human development characteristically goes through a series of stages. You can see human beings, and if the central thing about human beings is their powers, not their cognitive properties. You remember I talked last time about why the human being wasn't just a reflecting machine, but was an entity with powers that developed in response to needs. If you think of that as the central thing, then you can ask yourself, if you want to understand human beings and human institutions, you see how they characteristically develop their powers so as to satisfy their needs. How does that happen? And then Hegel makes a structure which he uses for analyzing this. And he says you can think about this in 3 stages. There's a stage in which people have what he calls an immediacy of power. There's a stage of alienation, and there's a stage of the reappropriation of alienated powers. There are 3 stages, roughly speaking. So, if you think, for example, about phenomena like revenge, or phenomena like learning languages, or phenomena like playing the violin, if you think of Aeschylus, the Oresteia, he describes a situation in which each clan immediately responds to a blood act by another clan. If a member of your clan kills one of my clan, I kill a member of your clan. There's an immediate tit for tat. And that, of course, leads to an infinite chain of revenge, of vendettas. And the plays describe the way in which you move from that situation to a situation in which you give the power to punish, you take it away from the people of the clan who are offended, and you give it to a central authority. So in the beginning, we all sit together. You're a member of Corpus Christi College, you're a member of King's College, and a member of Corpus Christi knifes a member of King's College, and then you immediately have the power to revenge by knifing another member of King's College, or vice versa. And there, Hegel would say, that's a situation in which you have certain immediate powers. You're doing something. If you get struck, you immediately strike back. Now you move from that to a situation in which instead of you knifing the member of King's College, if the member of King's College has knifed a member of your college, you have a university board who has proctors and policemen, and the proctors and you now are no longer allowed to revenge yourself on the person who inflicts a wound on you. That power is taken out of your hands and is now located in the university police force. So the university police force now takes care of the situation. Now, what Hegel says is, you can describe that situation as a situation in which certain immediate human powers are made alien to the people who exercise them. It used to be, you smacked me, I smacked you. Now it's the case that there is still a smacking power, but the smacking power is no longer located in me. The smacking power is now located in an alien structure, a structure which I can see to be distinct from me. You smack me, I don't smack you back immediately. We call the university proctors, and the university proctors come in and smack you, or put you in prison, or do whatever they want to do with you. So there's a way. So the intuition is, it's a characteristic way in which human powers develop, that the immediate exercise of those powers comes to be alienated. We come in social context to create institutions and vest the powers that we have in those institutions. Now, in doing that, Hegel says, there will be a definite loss of a certain kind. That is, I will no longer be the immediate person who is the source of activity of this. The immediate source will be the policeman. However, he says, that alienation, under ideal circumstances, can actually have benefits, because by virtue of alienating those powers to that institution, eventually getting that institution under collective control, I could reach a situation in which at the end I've reappropriated those powers. So I first have the power simply to respond in vengeance. I act on my immediate impulse, I have the power to do it, and I have the justification to do it, I have the warrant to do it. And Marx says, that's a meaningful interaction. It's meaningful that if you slap me, I slap you. It's a source of meaning, too. Then second, we take that power away from the immediate people who exercise it, and we locate it in an institution that's separate. Now, he says, that institution can, and in general will, come to confront me as something alien, different. It's now the police force. It's not just people beating one another up. It's this entity out there which is responsible not directly to me but to the state. and that entity therefore confronts me as something which is separate from me, distinct from me, and might actually have power over me. That's a state in which I've alienated my powers. Now Marx says, but you could imagine a situation in which, after a long period in which the police force is just an arm, say, of the aristocracy, the society comes to be democratized in various sorts of ways, and so the police force there are powers located. So alienating the powers, he says too, is in good circumstances in general going to make them more efficient and better, because instead of if a strong person hits another strong person, the person who's insulted him or struck can hit back. If you hit me, there's nothing I can do, because what am I going to do? What am I going to do? It's a bit, what am I going to do? Tell you about me, what form would my revenge take? Telling you a boring story, telling you a bad joke. But the policeman is chosen to be a locus who is particularly efficient at this. So for Hegel, I'm talking just about Hegel now. I'm talking about the Hegelian background to the Marxist conception. So for Hegel, the externalization of these things is often associated with an increase in the power and efficiency of the thing, because you don't have to be powerful yourself. You've got a powerful agent there who is the police. But the increase of power and effectiveness is associated with an alienation of the power, too. Because although the policeman is more powerful and more efficient, he's different from you. And therefore, you see him rightly as an external obstacle to your duty. You would prefer, perhaps, to smack the person yourself, but the policeman stops you. So the policeman is encountered as an obstacle rather than as something different from you, something who doesn't necessarily have your interests at heart, and who is a separate source of being. So, and that sort of situation. And now he says, you could imagine a situation in which the police force no longer has that property by virtue of them being embedded, he doesn't expatiate on this. Well, Hegel thinks by the police force being embedded in a social constitution and having people having power over the police, etc. So you've got a state of immediacy, a state of alienation, and a state of the overcoming of alienation, or the reappropriation of powers. Or another example is language learning. Hegel talks about Bildung and culture. And he says, look, suppose we're all talking in our own natural, immediate way. So I speak in the way in which people from the East Coast of the United States speak, and other people speak in their own native sort of ways, etc. Now there's a certain power I have which I exercise. But now at a certain point, suppose we all are learned to talk. We're all supposed to talk proper. That is, suppose we now say it isn't enough that I speak in the way that people in Philadelphia speak, and you speak in the way the people in Yorkshire speak, and you just speak the way you speak. Because communication is not optimized in that way. You won't necessarily understand me. Rather, we have a uniform international English language. There are standards for that. There are schools for that. There are books for that. And therefore, you start as a young person speaking in the way you do. You then go to school, and in going to school, you learn how to do it correctly. Now, the school is then a form of alienation because you speak in a certain way, but the members of the school board have their own view about how you should speak. And the members of the school board prescribe to you how you must speak. So it's particularly clear in the Middle Ages, of course, when you go to school, you have to speak Latin. The statutes are you can't speak the vernacular. So you're Albertus Magnus. You grew up somewhere around Cologne, speaking some kind of dialect. You go to school, suddenly you're whipped if you speak Middle High German. You have to speak Latin. So there's an alienation of the immediate human powers to a separate institution, which is the institution of books, international academies, schools, etc. However, Hegel says, if Albertus Magnus actually does learn Latin, that is, if he does succeed in not only speaking in Kölnisch or whatever he's speaking in, but learns proper international Latin. By doing that, he has reappropriated these alienated powers in some sense. And similarly, I'm just giving examples again. Similarly with violinists, we all heard these stories about gypsy violinists who are untutored, right? They just play the way they play. And my friends in Berlin used to tell me about what would happen to them. They'd find this gypsy violinist somewhere in Eastern Europe. They'd bring the gypsy violinist and give the gypsy violinist lessons. That was the end. They just couldn't play anymore. That shows that was not a healthy development, because the healthy development would be the gypsy violinist plays wie ihm der Schnabel gewachsen ist. He just plays straightforwardly. And then he's taken to the music high school, and he's forced to play arpeggios in a way, and he can actually do it, and then he comes out as a better violinist. Okay, so for Hegel, this is a scheme, a general philosophical schema that you can apply to human life in any number of ways. Immediacy, alienation, and the overcoming of alienation. Now, I should also say, this is terribly important about Hegel. You will then immediately, or if you have a certain kind of philosophical sensibility, you'll immediately say, what about, if there's immediate powers and there's alienation and there's the overcoming of alienation, then what are the real immediate powers? There must be some bedrock of really basic human powers that are just the immediate powers. So what are the immediate powers then? You might ask that question. And now it's really important for the Hegelian project to see that question makes no sense. What distinguishes Hegel from analytical philosophy and Plato and Kant and other things is that he thinks that question doesn't make sense, because he thinks that language is inherent, or conceptualization is inherently a matter of moving from one semantic structure to another. That is, Plato thinks, as you know, the way you start in philosophy is you define what justice is. And you've got to have a clear definition of what justice is, and that's got to be necessary and sufficient conditions, and that's a fixed point and an absolute beginning. What Hegel says is, no concept can be fully specified through necessary and sufficient conditions. You can't define any of them. You can't define any philosophical concepts, because thought is essentially motion from one to another. So Hegel says, Plato says you have to start by defining the concept, then you go on. But the real activity is the activity in the dialogue of shifting from one to another. So this is a view that says that the central philosophical concepts have the property of something like being better than. So Plato says the central philosophical concepts are like cat. Is it a cat? Is it not a cat? Is it a cat? Is it a dog? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions? Hegel says, no, the central philosophical concepts are concepts like being better than. Now, being better than inherently has semantic open places. What do you mean is better than? Better in a moral sense, better in this sense, better in that sense, or being to the right of. There's no such thing as the thing which is absolutely to the right of anything else. So Hegel's idea is only through a completely you have a self-enclosed system of semantic structures, and the thought consists in moving around with them, through them, like a perpetual Platonic dialogue. And you can never stop at any place. That is, you can stop if you want, because you need to act, but you have to see that stopping is just something you've decided to do. It could actually go on forever. Therefore, the role of definition in Hegelian-style theories is completely different from the role of definition in Platonic or Kantian things. The role of definition in Hegelian thought things is to move the discussion on in some way, not to stop it and find a fixed point. There isn't any fixed point. The only fixed point is the whole thing altogether. And it's a whole thing, the structure which is it's being in continual movement. So when you ask, So Hegel says notoriously, there's nothing under heaven or earth that isn't at the same time immediate and mediated. So the distinction between mediate and immediate, so you can't, as it were, find a level of merely immediate human powers. So let me give you the example. So we take the gypsy violinist. The gypsy violinist, so that's in the story about the gypsy violinist coming to Berlin, that's his immediate powers. He's got these immediate powers, he plays the violin. And then he's alienated, and then he doesn't succeed in overcoming it. Now you might say, well, what about those powers that he had? Why do you call them immediate powers? They're not immediate powers. He only has them by virtue of having lived in this gypsy encampment and done various sorts of things, and then he got this. And Hegel's answer to that is, yes, absolutely, right. The structure, immediate, alienated, overcoming, is a structure, it's not a reality, it's a structure conceptualization, so you can apply it in different contexts. And that's why there's no natural place to start. The thing that looks, in one context, like immediacy, namely the gypsy violinist you find in some Hungarian village, that looks like immediacy, relative to the story you're trying to tell about what you can do with him in the conservatory in Berlin. But that thing, which in that context is immediate, is in another context a form of alienation, or in another context the result of a successful overcoming of alienation to reach that level. And there's no limit to that process. So this is a structure, Hegel thinks, that has wide application, and it's really important to see that if you ask the question of what is the aboriginal immediacy, that question makes no sense. It shows you've misunderstood the logic of the discussion. So, okay, that's all I'm going to say. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop now. Next time I'm going to talk about, Marx talks about alienation in three domains: religion, politics, and economics. And I'll talk a little bit about religion, a little bit about politics, Hegel, and a little bit about economics. I probably won't get that far, but that's where I'm going. Then, anyway, okay, so see those of you next time who can bear to make it next time.